It will now be necessary to ascertain what took place at the grocer's habitation subsequently to Amabel's abduction. Leonard Holt having departed, Pillicati was preparing to make good his retreat, when he was prevented by Blaze, who, hearing a noise in the yard, peeped cautiously out at the back door, and inquired who was there. "Are you Mr. Bloundell?" rejoined Pillicati, bethinking him of a plan to turn the tables upon the apprentice. "No, I am his porter," replied the other. "What, Blaze?" replied Pillicati. "Thunder and lightning! Don't you remember Bernard Boutefeu, the watchman?" "I don't remember any watchman of that name, and I cannot discern your features," rejoined Blaze. "But your voice sounds familiar to me. What are you doing there?" "I have been trying to prevent Leonard Holt from carrying off your master's daughter, the fair Mistress Amabel," answered Pillicati. "But he has accomplished his villainous purpose in spite of me." "The devil he has!" cried Blaze. "Here is a pretty piece of news for my master. But how did you discover him?" "Chancing to pass along the entry on the other side of that wall about a quarter of an hour ago," returned Pillicati, "I perceived a rope ladder fastened to it, and wishing to ascertain what was the matter, I mounted it, and had scarcely got over into the yard, when I saw two persons advancing. I concealed myself beneath the shadow of the wall, and they did not notice me, but I gathered from their discourse who they were and what was their design. I allowed Amabel to ascend, but just as the apprentice was following, I laid hold of the skirt of his doublet, and, pulling him back, desired him to come with me to his master. He answered by drawing his sword, and would have stabbed me, but I closed with him, and should have secured him if my foot had not slipped. While I was on the ground, he dealt me a severe blow, and ran after his mistress." "Just like him," replied Blaze. "He took the same cowardly advantage of me last night." "No punishment will be too severe for him," rejoined Pillicati, "and I hope your master will make a terrible example of him." "How fortunate I was not gone to bed," exclaimed Blaze. "I had just taken a couple of Rufuses, and was about to put on my nightcap, when, hearing a noise without, and being ever on the alert to defend my master's property, even at the hazard of my life, I stepped forth and found you." "I will bear testimony to your vigilance and courage," returned Pillicati, "but you had better go and alarm your master. I will wait here." Instantly, cried Blaze, rushing upstairs. On the way to Mr. Bloundell's chamber, he met Patience, and told her what he had heard. She was inclined to put a very different construction on the story, but as she bore the apprentice no particular goodwill, she determined to keep her opinion to herself, and let affairs take their course. The grocer was soon aroused, and scarcely able to credit the porter's intelligence, and yet fearing something must be wrong, he hastily attired himself, and proceeded to Amabel's room. It was empty, and it was evident from the state in which everything was left, that she had never retired to rest. Confounded by the sight, Bloundell then hurried downstairs in search of the apprentice, but he was nowhere to be found. By this time, Mrs. Bloundell had joined him, and on hearing Blaze's story, utterly scouted it. "It cannot be," she cried. "Leonard could have no motive for acting thus. He had our consent to the union, and the sole obstacle to it was Amabel herself. Is it likely he would run away with her?" "I am sure I do not know," replied Patience, "but he was desperately in love, that's certain, and when people are in love, I am told they do very strange and unaccountable things. Perhaps he may have carried her off against her will." "Very likely," rejoined Blaze. "I thought I heard a scream, and should have called out at the moment, but a rufus stuck in my throat and prevented me." "Where is the person who says he intercepted them?" asked Bloundell. "In the yard," answered Blaze. "Bid him come hither," rejoined his master. "Stay, I will go to him myself." With this, The whole party, including old Josina and Stephen, the two boys and little Christiana not having been disturbed, proceeded to the yard, where they found Pillicati in his watchman's dress, who related his story more circumstantially than before. "I don't believe a word of it," cried Mrs. Bloundel, "and I will stake my life it is one of the Earl of Rochester's tricks." "Were I assured that such was the case," said the grocer, in a stern whisper to his wife, "I would stir no further in the matter." My threat to Amabel was not an idle one. "I may be mistaken," returned Mrs. Bloundel, almost at her wits' end with anxiety. "Don't mind what I say. Judge for yourself." "Oh dear! What will become of her?" she mentally ejaculated. "Lanterns and links," cried Pillicati. "Do you mean to impeach my veracity, good mistress? I am an old soldier, and as tenacious of my honor as your husband is of his credit." "This blustering will not serve your turn, fellow," observed the grocer, seizing him by the collar. "I begin to suspect my wife is in the right, and will at all events detain you." "Detain me? On what ground?" asked Pillicati. "As an accomplice in my daughter's abduction," replied Bloundel. "Here, Blaze, Stephen, hold him while I call the watch. This is a most mysterious affair, but I will soon get at the bottom of it." By the grocer's directions, Pillicati, who very quietly entered the house, and surrendered his halberd to Blaze, was taken to the kitchen. Bloundel then set forth, leaving Stephen on guard at the yard door, while his wife remained in the shop, awaiting his return. On reaching the kitchen with the prisoner, Blaze besought his mother, who, as well as Patience, had accompanied him thither, to fetch a bottle of sack. While she went for the wine, and the porter was stalking to and fro before the door with the halberd on his shoulder, Patience whispered to Pillicati, "I know who you are. You came here last night with the Earl of Rochester in the disguise of a quack doctor." "Hush!" cried Pillicati, placing his finger on his lips. "I am not going to betray you," returned Patience, in the same tone. "But you are sure to be found out, and had better beat a retreat before Mr. Bloundel returns." "I won't lose a moment," replied Pillicati, starting to his feet. "What's the matter?" cried Blaze, suddenly halting. "I only got up to see whether the wine was coming," replied Pillicati. "Yes, here it is," replied Blaze, as his mother reappeared, "and now you shall have a glass of such sack as you never yet tasted." And pouring out a bumper, he offered it to Pillicati. The latter took the glass, but his hand shook so violently that he could not raise it to his lips. "What ails you, friend?" inquired Blaze, uneasily. "I don't know," replied Pillicati, "but I feel extremely unwell." "He looks to me as if he had got the plague," observed Patience, to Blaze. "The plague!" exclaimed the latter, letting fall the glass, which shivered to pieces on the stone floor. "And I have touched him. Where is the vinegar bottle? I must sprinkle myself directly, and rub myself from head to foot with oil of hartshorn and spirits of sulphur. Mother! Dear mother! You have taken away my medicine chest. If you love me, go and fetch me a little conserve of Roman wormwood in Mithridate. You will find them in 2 small jars." "Oh yes, do," cried Patience, "or he may die with fright." Moved by their joint entreaties, old Josina again departed, and her back was no sooner turned, than Patience said in an undertone to Pillicati, "Now is your time. You have not a moment to lose." Instantly taking the hint, the other uttered a loud cry, and springing up, caught at Blaze, who instantly dropped the halberd, and fled into one corner of the room. Pillicati then hurried upstairs, while Blaze shouted after him, "Don't touch him, Master Stephen. He has got the plague. He has got the plague." Alarmed by this outcry, Stephen suffered Pillicuddy to pass, and the latter, darting across the yard, mounted the rope ladder, and quickly disappeared. A few minutes afterwards, Bloundel returned with the watch, and was greatly enraged when he found that the prisoner had got off. No longer doubting that he had been robbed of his daughter by the Earl of Rochester, he could not make up his mind to abandon her to her fate, and his conflicting feelings occasioned him a night of indescribable anxiety. The party of watch whom he had summoned searched the street for him, and endeavored to trace out the fugitives, but without success, and they returned before daybreak to report their failure. About 6 o'clock, Mr. Bloundel, unable to restrain himself longer, sallied forth with Blaise in search of his daughter and Leonard. Uncertain where to bend his steps, he trusted to chance to direct him, resolved, if he were unsuccessful, to lay a petition for redress before the throne. Proceeding along Cheapside, he entered Paternoster Row, and traversed it till he came to Paul's Alley, a narrow passage leading to the northwest corner of the cathedral. Prompted by an unaccountable impulse, he no sooner caught sight of the reverend structure, than he hastened towards it, and knocked against the great northern door. We shall, however, precede him, and return to the party at the altar. The awful warning of Solomon Eagle so alarmed Quatermain, that he let fall his prayer book, and after gazing vacantly round for a few moments, staggered to one of the stalls, where, feeling a burning pain in his breast, he tore open his doublet, and found that the enthusiast had spoken the truth, and that he was really attacked by the pestilence. As to Amabel, on hearing the terrible denunciation, she uttered a loud cry, and would have fallen to the ground but for the timely assistance of the apprentice, who caught her with one arm, while with the other he defended himself against the Earl and his companions. But, in spite of his resistance, they would have soon compelled him to relinquish his charge, if Solomon Eagle, who had hitherto contented himself with gazing sternly on what was passing, had not interfered, and, rushing towards the combatants, seized Rochester and Etheridge, and hurled them backwards with almost supernatural force. When they arose, and menaced him with their swords, he laughed loudly and contemptuously, crying, "Advance, if ye dare. And try your strength against one armed by heaven, and you will find how far it will avail." At this juncture, Leonard Holt heard a musical voice behind him, and turning, beheld Nizamakaskri. She beckoned him to follow her, and, raising Amabel in his arms, he ran towards the door leading to St. Faith's, through which his conductress passed. All this was the work of a moment, and when Rochester and Etheridge, who rushed after him, tried the door, they found it fastened within inside. Just then, a loud knocking was heard at the northern entrance of the cathedral, and a verger answering the summons, Mr. Bloundel and Blaise were admitted. On beholding the newcomers, Rochester and his companions were filled with confusion. Equally astonished at the rencounter, the grocer grasped his staff, and rushing up to the Earl, demanded, in a voice that made the other, despite his natural audacity, quail, "Where is my child, my lord? What have you done with her?" "I know nothing about her," replied Rochester, with affected carelessness. "Yes, I am wrong," he added, as if recollecting himself, "I am told she has run away with your apprentice." Pillicuddy, who had changed his attire since his escape from the grocer's dwelling, thought he might now venture to address him without fear of discovery, and, setting his arms akimbo, and assuming a swaggering demeanor, strutted forward and said, "Your daughter has just been wedded to Leonard Holt, Mr. Bloundel." "It is false," cried Bloundel, "as false as the character you just personated, for I recognize you as the knave who recently appeared before me as a watchman." "I pledge you my word as a nobleman," interposed Rochester, "that your daughter has just descended to St. Faith's with your apprentice." "I can corroborate his lordship's assertion," said Etheridge. "And I," added Pillicuddy. "By the holy apostle to whom this fane is dedicated." "It is so." "To convince you that we speak the truth, we will go with you and assist you to search," said Rochester. Attaching little credit to what he heard, and yet unwilling to lose a chance of recovering his daughter, the grocer rushed to the door indicated by his informant, but found it fastened. "You had better go to the main entrance," said one of the vergers. "I have the keys with me, and will admit you." "I will keep guard here till you return," said another verger. Accompanied by Rochester and Etheridge, Blondel then proceeded to the chief door of the subterranean church. It was situated at the south of the cathedral, between two of the larger buttresses, and at the foot of a flight of stone steps. On reaching it, the verger produced his keys, but they were of no avail, for the door was barred within inside. After many fruitless attempts to obtain admission, they were fain to give up the attempt. "Well, if we cannot get in, no one shall get out," observed the verger. "The only key that opens this door is in my possession, so we have them safe enough." The party then returned to the cathedral, where they found Blaise, Pillicati, and the two other vergers keeping watch at the door near the choir. No one had come forth. Rochester then walked apart with his companions, while Blondel, feeling secure so long as he kept the Earl in view, folded his arms upon his breast, and determined to await the result. By this time, the doors being opened, a great crowd was soon collected within the sacred structure. St. Paul's churchyard, as is well known, was formerly the great mart for booksellers, who have not, even in later times, deserted the neighborhood, but still congregate in Paternoster Row, Ave Maria Lane, and the adjoining streets. At the period of this history they did not confine themselves to the precincts of the cathedral, but, as has been previously intimated, fixed their shops against the massive pillars of its nave. Besides booksellers, there were seamstresses, tobacco merchants, vendors of fruit and provisions, and Jews, all of whom had stalls within the cathedral, and who were now making preparations for the business of the day. Shortly afterwards, numbers who came for recreation and amusement made their appearance, and before 10 o'clock, Paul's Walk, as the nave was termed, was thronged by apprentices, rufflers, porters, water carriers, higglers, with baskets on their heads, or under their arms, fishwives, quack doctors, cut purses, bonarobas, merchants, lawyers, and serving men, who came to be hired, and who stationed themselves near an oaken block attached to one of the pillars, and which was denominated, from the use it was put to, the serving man's log. Some of the crowd were smoking, some laughing, others gathering round a ballad singer, who was chanting one of Rochester's own licentious ditties. Some were buying quack medicines and remedies for the plague, the virtues of which the vendor loudly extolled, while others were paying court to the dames, many of whom were masked. Everything seemed to be going forward within this sacred place, except devotion. Here, a man, mounted on the carved marble of a monument, bellowed forth the news of the Dutch war, while another, not far from him, on a bench, announced in lugubrious accents the number of those who had died on the previous day of the pestilence. There, at the very font, was a usurer paying over a sum of money to a gallant. It was Sir Paul Paravison, who was sealing a bond for thrice the amount of the loan. There, a party of choristers, attended by a troop of boys, were pursuing another gallant, who had ventured into the cathedral booted and spurred, and were demanding spur money of him, an exaction which they claimed as part of their perquisites. An admirable picture of this curious scene has been given by Bishop Earle, in his Microcosmographia, published in 1629. Paul's Walk, he writes, is the land's epitome, or you may call it the Lesser Isle of Great Britain. It is more than this, it is the whole world's map, which you may here discern in its perfectest motion, jostling and turning. It is a heap of stones and men, with a vast confusion of languages, and were the steeple not sanctified, nothing could be like her babble. The noise in it is like that of bees, a strange humming, or buzzing, mixed of walking, tongues, and feet. It is a kind of still roar, or loud whisper. It is the great exchange of all discourse, and no business whatsoever, but is here stirring and afoot. It is the synod of all parts politic, jointed and laid together in most serious posture, and they are not half so busy at the Parliament. It is the market of young lecturers, whom you may cheapen here at all rates and sizes. It is the general mint of all famous lies, which are here, like the legends of popery, first coined and stamped in the church. All inventions are emptied here, and not a few pockets. The best sign of the temple in it is that it is the thieves' sanctuary, who rob more safely in a crowd than a wilderness, while every pillar is a bush to hide them. It is the other expense of the day, after plays and taverns, and men have still some oaths to swear here. The visitants are all men without exceptions, but the principal inhabitants are stale knights and captains out of service, men of long rapiers and short purses, who after all turn merchants here, and traffic for news. Some make it a preface to their dinner, and travel for an appetite, but thirstier men make it their ordinary, and board here very cheap. Of all such places it is least haunted by hobgoblins, for if a ghost would walk here, he could not. Dekker, moreover, terms Paul's Walk, or the Mediterranean Isle, in his Gull's Horn book, the only gallery wherein the pictures of all your true fashionate and complemental gulls are, and ought to be, hung up. After giving circumstantial directions for the manner of entering the walk, he proceeds thus: bend your course directly in the middle line that the whole body of the church may appear to be yours, where in view of all, you may publish your suit in what manner you affect most, either with the slide of your cloak from the one shoulder or the other. He then recommends the gull, after 4 or 5 turns in the nave, to betake himself to some of the sempsters' shops, the new tobacco office, or the bookseller's stalls, where, if you cannot read, exercise your smoke, and inquire who has written against the divine weed. Such, or something like it, was Paul's walk at the period of this history. The grocer, who had not quitted his post, remained a silent and sorrowful spectator of the scene. Despite his anxiety, he could not help moralizing upon it, and it furnished him with abundant food for reflection. As to Rochester and his companions, they mingled with the crowd, though the Earl kept a wary eye on the door, chatted with the prettiest damsels, listened to the newsmongers, and broke their fast at the stall of a vendor of provisions, who supplied them with tolerable viands, and a bottle of excellent Rhenish. Blaise was soon drawn away by one of the quacks, and, in spite of his master's angry looks, he could not help purchasing one of the infallible antidotes offered for sale by the charlatan. Paravicin had no sooner finished his business with the usurer than he strolled along the nave, and was equally surprised and delighted at meeting with his friends, who briefly explained to him why they were there. "And how do you expect the adventure to terminate?" asked Paravicin, laughing heartily at the recital. "Heaven knows," replied the Earl. "But what are you doing here?" "I came partly to replenish my purse, for I have had a run of ill luck of late," replied the knight, "and partly to see a most beautiful creature, whom I accidentally discovered here yesterday." "A new beauty," cried Rochester. "Who is she?" "Before I tell you, you must engage not to interfere with me," replied Paravicin. "I have marked her for my own." "Agreed," replied Rochester. "Now, her name?" "She is the daughter of a blind piper, who haunts the cathedral," replied Paravicin, "and her name is Nizza Macascree." "Is it not charming?" "But you shall see her." "We must not go too far from the door of St. Faith's," rejoined Rochester. "Can you not contrive to bring her hither?" "That is more easily said than done," replied Paravicin. "She is as coy as the grocer's daughter. However, I will try to oblige you." With this, he quitted his companions, and returning shortly afterwards, said, "My mistress has likewise disappeared. I found the old piper seated at the entrance of Bishop Kemp's chapel, attended by his dog, but he missed his daughter when he awoke in the morning, and is in great trouble about her." "Strange," cried Etheridge, "I begin to think the place is enchanted." "It would seem so, indeed," replied Rochester. While they were thus conversing, Pillicati, who was leaning against a column, with his eye fixed upon the door leading to St. Faith's, observed it open, and the apprentice issue from it accompanied by 2 masked females. All 3 attempted to dart across the transept and gain the northern entrance, but they were intercepted. Mr. Bloundell caught hold of Leonard's arm, and Rochester seized her, whom he judged by the garb to be Amabel, while Paravicin, recognizing Nizza Macascree, as he thought, by her dress, detained her. "What is the meaning of all this, Leonard?" demanded the grocer, angrily. "You shall have an explanation instantly," replied the apprentice, but think not of me, think only of your daughter." My father," cried the damsel, who had been detained by Paravicin, taking off her mask, and rushing towards the grocer. "Who then have I got?" cried Rochester. "The piper's daughter, I'll be sworn," replied Etheridge. "You are right," replied Nizza, unmasking. "I changed dresses with Amabel, and hoped by so doing to accomplish her escape, but we have been baffled. However, as her father is here, it is of little consequence." "Amabel," said the grocer, repulsing her, "before I receive you again, I must be assured that you have not been alone with the Earl of Rochester." "She has not, sir," replied the apprentice. "Visit your displeasure on my head. I carried her off and would have wedded her." "What motive had you for this strange conduct?" asked Bloundel, incredulously. Before Leonard could answer, Pillicuddy stepped forward, and said to the grocer, "Mr. Bloundel, you are deceived, on the faith of a soldier you are." "Peace, fool," said Rochester, "I will not be outdone in generosity by an apprentice. Leonard Holt speaks the truth." "If so," replied Bloundel, "he shall never enter my house again. Send for your indentures tonight," he continued sharply, to Leonard, "but never venture to approach me more." "Father, you are mistaken," cried Amabel. "Leonard Holt is not to blame. I alone deserve your displeasure." "Be silent," whispered the apprentice, "you destroy yourself. I care not what happens to me, provided you escape the Earl." "Come home, mistress," cried the grocer, dragging her through the crowd which had gathered round them. "Here is a pretty conclusion to the adventure," cried Paravicin, "but where is the apprentice, and where is the pretty Nizza Macascree? For heaven," he added, as he looked around for them in vain, "I should not wonder if they have eloped together." "Nor I," replied Rochester. "I admire the youth's spirit, and trust he may be more fortunate with his second mistress than with his first." "It shall be my business to prevent that," rejoined Paravicin. "Help me to search for her."